Tec Sounds presents EduTrends.
Welcome to the EduTrends podcast and videocast, brought to you by the Institute for the Future of Education of Tecnológico de Monterrey. I am your host, José Pepe Escamilla, IFE Associate Director. In this episode, I had the pleasure to talk with the co-CEO at HolonIQ, Patrick Brothers, about the EdTech market, the startup ecosystem in Latin America, and the three scenarios for higher education that HolonIQ describes. Enjoy. Hi, Patrick. Welcome to this episode of EduTrends podcast and webcast produced by the Institute for the Future of Education of Tecnológico de Monterrey. We are very happy to have you here. I would like first to briefly describe for our audience what is HolonIQ and also what are your current goals and what are you aiming for in education.
Fabulous. Thank you, Pepe. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. As Pepe said, Patrick Brothers, co-CEO of HolonIQ. We're a global impact intelligence platform, and we work with governments, universities, firms, and investors around the world to help power decisions that matter. We've had a really big focus on higher education over the last few years, mostly because much of the team is from higher education on the public and the private side. And of course, before COVID, higher education was moving through a really big change and transformation, and COVID, of course, has just amplified that 10, 100 times again. So we've spent a lot of time over the last while pulling apart the trends that we see happening, talking to universities around the world, and just helping everyone make sense of what we think might be the future of higher education.
Thank you. So you say that higher education was already changing. I am a little bit more pessimistic around that. I think that higher education has not changed a lot on the last years, and I want it to change faster. Nevertheless, I recognize that the COVID situation that was very bad in many different ways. One of the good things, one of the good outcomes, is that it shows that when we face something that is urgent, we can align ourselves to change and go faster. No?
I think that's right. I think just jumping in, I mean, before COVID, there was still a really strong conversation about how do we increase access to higher education? How do we reduce the cost of higher education? And there was a lot of, in the general consumer market, a lot of criticism about the return on investment of higher education. And of course, digital transformation was happening to universities as well. And we saw, MOOCs, and we saw micro-credentials and things like that. But so, I remember really clearly before COVID, and it's interesting how many new people have come into the conversation in the last couple of years. I mean, it's so great to have fresh ideas. But I agree with you. You could take a pessimistic view that higher education hasn't changed for hundreds of years. And, I'm trying to balance that a little bit with, there was some really innovative things happening. Like Tec de Monterrey is a great example. There were amazing initiatives with, ideas about how to solve all of those challenges. But there's no doubt that COVID just reset the whole landscape.
Thank you. No, thank you for what you think about Tec de Monterrey. And it's very, very nice to have the opinion coming from you. So during you say that during the COVID, the pandemic, something changed. What are the things in the EdTech market in particular that changed because of the crisis?
Yeah. I think what COVID did is, without getting too academic, is it isolated a whole bunch of variables and made us really rethink what is higher education. And in education technology, it obviously kind of put education technology at the forefront, because that was, for the most part, the only means of connecting with learners around the world. And so some of the big trends that we saw was what they would call in EdTech direct to consumer, where EdTech companies were connecting directly with learners, not through an institution, to support upskilling and support corporate training. I mean, in the workforce side of education technology has been massive because companies have been looking for ways to support their staff around the world without being able to be in physical training programs and the like. And of course, for full-time students or part-time students studying at a university, I mean, it was just we've been talking forever about how lectures are boring and not great pedagogy, and it forced us to rethink about how do we deliver learning remotely and how do we deliver it in a way that is more engaging. But of course, COVID also revealed some really poor parts of education technology too. And so, I mean, we've seen a massive growth though overall in education technology, just enormous. It has been double what it was before, at least in almost all parts of the world. So big changes. I'm sure everyone's feeling.
I remember a piece of a report that you published a couple of years ago that during the last decade, venture capital in EdTech grew 14 times, and the expectation at that time is that during this, from 2020 to 2030, the growth will be threefold, 3 times. So what will be your new?
That was conservative. I mean, it's so funny because when we published that analysis, we had a whole bunch of people saying, "Oh, that's a bit aggressive, and this is a bit of a bubble, and I think it will."
We are arriving to plateau or something like that. No?
Plateau, exactly right. And you're right. It started at the beginning of last decade. $500 million globally was invested in EdTech, and we finished the decade at around $7-8 billion, and so something like 14 times. But then along came 2020, 2021. 2021 may be close to a $20 billion investment, which would be 40 times 2010 in terms of the level of investment. And back when we looked at 2018 and 2019 and thought, I wonder if they are bubbles that will burst. I mean, we just had no idea. So you're right. Like we forecast, I think in 2019, we said, oh, look, we think $90 billion will be invested in EdTech over the next decade. And then the year after, 16 billion was invested. Now this year will be nearly 20. So, half of our decade forecast is already invested. So it's just a whole new level.
So so 40 is 40 now 40 times the growth just in the last year. And but what do you think that we should expect for the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's 2 schools of thought, right? There's one school which is along the lines we saw before, which is maybe we're going through a temporary COVID surge and we'll see some level of, moderation, and it will still be very high compared to what it was before COVID, but it will moderate. The other school of thought is that we're only really just beginning to grasp how extensive this digital transformation will be, and that the surge we're seeing right now is a short-term surge that will be part of a long-term transition. I mean, education technology is still only about 4% of total expenditure in education. And that's a very small amount. And so it doesn't have to really be much bigger in terms of that percentage to double in size from a dollar perspective. So, I mean, we think, it'll be somewhere in between is always the safe answer, but there's no doubt there's some expenditure happening right now that doesn't need to be repeated. But at the same time, I think a lot of teams are getting together and saying, wow, now that we're starting to get our feet back on the ground, we need to think about our digital transformation, and that will give rise to further investment again.
Yes, so maybe the most plausible scenario is that this is a surge, but after the surge, we will not come back to what we had beforehand. So it will be the spark of a new kind of growth, not as dramatic as the one that we had lived during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And what about Latin America? What can you tell us about the EdTech startup ecosystem in Latin America? What have you learned?
I can tell you a lot. Last week, we announced the 2021 HolonIQ LATAM EdTech 100, which is the 100 most promising education technology companies across Latin America and the Caribbean. I mean, last year, when we did it for the first time, we set out to map 50 companies because we thought, LATAM is a very dynamic and very large market, but doesn't have as much investment as other parts of the world. What we found in our investigation is there was a massive ecosystem. And so we ended up announcing 100 last year. This year, a lot has changed. And from an investment perspective, the investment in education technology just in the first 3 quarters of 2021 is already 3 times what it was the prior year. So we're seeing a lot of demand from schools and from universities. We're seeing the investment community in Latin America start to think more progressively about supporting social and economic outcomes, and they see the opportunity as well. Again, the innovation is all the way from early childhood and pre-K through school, post-secondary. There's more vocational education, which, Latin America has less vocational education than other parts of the world, but we're starting to see more apprenticeships, more workforce training, and then just as everywhere else in the world, we're seeing the big companies in Latin America turning to education technology to upskill their staff and their workforces and find employees as well. It's very exciting watching education technology in Latin America.
Thank you for your insights. Very, very interesting, the increase that you have seen in the area in just one year. And you're right, investment is not abundant in this region. So it's good to see that there is a 3-fold increase in just 1 year. Is very promising. At the beginning of this year, you updated a study about the possible futures of higher education. You published scenarios for higher education. Can you tell us about these scenarios and if you think they're still holding up after these months because of the rapid changes that we're living?
Yeah, so we love scenario planning because it forces you to think about what are the underlying changes that might happen that we're all unsure about, the uncertainties. And each of the scenarios we developed represented, if you like, an extreme. And when we talk about scenarios, we don't think that any one of those scenarios will be what plays out. What we are trying to provoke is a conversation between executives teams about what if this scenario started to play out? How would we be impacted? How would we be prepared? How would we support the learner? So the 3 scenarios, the first one was called...
So let me just interrupt you. Sorry. The scenarios are not possible futures. They're mainly like food for thought for educational planners. Is that what you're saying?
They are possible, but they represent extremes.
Okay.
They represent extreme endpoints. And so they shouldn't be read in, literally that this is the outcome that will happen. What they're trying to demonstrate, each of the scenarios, is what would happen if the world started to play out in a very specific direction. So the 3 scenarios were called education state, practicum pivot, and learning market. And let me just really quickly explain each one. Education state represented essentially the public sector and government deciding that it needed to double down on its role in driving post-secondary learning and higher education. And it did things such as starting to recognize micro-credentials as part of the formal accreditation frameworks. And that's very significant because that would mean universities would start to provide, say, programs that were nationally accredited in countries around the world down to about 150 hours of learning. And that seems to be the threshold that the Europeans and many other micro-credential bodies around the world are starting to rest on, is a minimum level of learning of about 150 hours to call it a micro-credential. So education state represented, the governments of the world saying, we want to ensure that higher education remains a government-funded, predominantly public-driven market, and we're going to offer micro-credentials. We are going to restructure universities to do that. The second scenario was called Practicum Pivot, which represents a very big change in the structure of learning, in that universities tended to now offer 3-month to 2-year programs as the predominant undergraduate product, if you like. And so obviously that's a dramatic shortening of a bachelor's program that we see around the world today. Governments would start to split research and teaching out to try and bifurcate those two roles for universities as part of that process as well. And we would see a very strong adoption of apprenticeships and of internships being woven into those much shorter programs at universities as well. So you would perhaps leave school, do 3 months at Tec de Monterrey, and then you'd go out to work and you'd work for a year. And then you might come back and do 3 months top up, and then you go back to work again. And so instead of it being a very lumpy post-school program, it would be shorter, more iterative, and woven into your work. And the final scenario, called learning market, essentially represented the deregulation of higher education, where the private sector upskilling came in. Accreditation frameworks would not be really as relevant because employers were recognizing credentials provided by anyone, not just universities. Universities would no longer, if you like, dominate higher education. The government in this scenario says we're agnostic as to who delivers the learning in higher education, because we want to really drive innovation across the public and the private sector. And so learning market represents, more of a market-based approach to higher education. So the three extremes are education state, which is, it looks a lot like it does today. The government doubles down on funding higher education, although we do see the adoption of micro-credentials in formal accreditation frameworks. Practicum Pivot is much shorter, much more linked programs into industry, apprenticeships and the like. And learning market is, if you like, a free market for post-secondary upskilling and skills, and probably represents even shorter programs, again, coming out of school and getting a role. So they were the three scenarios for higher education.
And there's very interesting, the scenarios, as you said, they're extreme, but I imagine that there can be a combination of
course,
of these scenarios. Do you think there's one of them that has the most likelihood to somehow happen, either completely or partially?
It's super interesting, and I think it really varies by region around the world. We asked our higher education network what was their preferred scenario and what they thought was the most likely scenario. And the most preferred scenario was Practicum Pivot, which was essentially universities really compressing their programs down in size and weaving them much tighter into industry. That was the most popular. The highest probability was still education state, where we're seeing around the world, say, take the US as an example, a lot of policies around community college and a lot of policies around, strengthening higher education institutions, although that's difficult for most governments around the world who don't have much money, having just stimulated their economies post-COVID, only 10 years, 20 years after major financial crises around the world as well. So yeah, it will be a blend for sure, as you say, Pepe.
Yes, very interesting food for thought. These three scenarios. I would like to change the subject now to once again go to EdTech, to educational technology, and who benefits more from the use of technology. So, in general, the people that traditionally benefit from the use of technology are the elites, or people that have access to the technology, or they are provided this technology in their educational institutions. But I wonder, what's your opinion on who will be better, who will have greatest delta of learning outcomes from the use of technology, the elites or the underserved populations?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the elites need any more help, right? So, I think that there's definitely a cohort of education technology which relies on expensive hardware and very high levels of bandwidth that only a privileged few, relatively speaking, can access. But reflecting on the EdTech 100, there's a lot of teams there who are very focused on the underserved communities and minorities, and who are thinking really carefully about what they could do. Technology as well, the way we define it, doesn't necessarily mean high-tech software. Technology means innovation. Much as the wheel itself represents technology a long time ago. And so that's the spirit in which we think about education technology, is not necessarily high cost, fancy software that will only serve to increase the gap between those who are privileged and others, but rather trying to stimulate more thinking and innovation about how either teams can directly support learners, or they can support institutions to better serve learners around the world. I mean, Africa as well is another economy where we're seeing innovation that is, it's not software, it's not mobile phones, it's not apps, innovation to help reach, very disconnected communities and help upskill them as well. And we've seen a lot of, even in LATAM quite recently, we've seen government announcements. One thing COVID did is it really raised everyone's awareness about the digital divide, about access to connectivity, bandwidth. There's plenty of EdTech trials, government sponsored around the world, of just handing out iPads to people that just fail, because that's not really a sound way of supporting learners, of just giving them devices, right? And I think we're learning that these lessons through time as well. So things like, I can think of teams that are supporting women in gaining coding skills to help achieve better gender balance, but also to help with the participation of women in the technology economy across Latin America as well. And a lot of that is not about devices, and it's actually not about serving those who are privileged either. It's about finding people who don't necessarily have access and can't afford a degree, for example, but who might be really well suited to learning coding or user experience or digital marketing, or even cybersecurity, which is becoming a big issue for everybody.
Yes, I agree with you. There is a paradox that, in my opinion, these kind of tools can be more advantageous for the underserved communities than for the communities that already have access to that, because they are privileged in somehow and have a lot of cultural capital, now let's say in their families, etc. So many people wonder if a government should invest in technology for those communities, or they should invest in other things. So that's what I think is an interesting question. And well, in studies we have made with underserved communities, we have found that in general, with the right tools, those communities, they don't have to be very high tech,
Right.
expensive technologies. The gains that you obtain are very hard, very, very strong, because they come almost from the bottom, let's say. So those investments have a lot of return on. There's a lot of return on investment on those, but you have to find the right way of doing that. And then the problem is how we close this access not only to internet but to this technology gap and this I would say digital competencies for learning gaps for the students, and digital competencies for teaching for teachers. It's a hard problem to solve, because we're talking of massive numbers of students and teachers.
You raised a great point just now in terms of I think one of our biggest priorities is actually supporting teachers and helping teachers understand what options they have, how to best utilize them. Teaching with technology is a little bit different. Like, the fundamentals of pedagogy are the same, but you go about things differently in the classroom in order to achieve those outcomes. And I think supporting teachers is a great example of where we should focus, and not necessarily race ahead at handing out computers and tablets without having thought through how we're going to actually upskill these communities and what is required. There's hundreds of stories around the world of classrooms being full of dusty 3D printers and 100 iPads over in the corner that can't charge or whatever, because people didn't think about how to support that kind of digital capability. So I'm all for upskilling teachers. I think that could have a really massive multiplier effect.
Exactly. I agree with you. And I'm asked sometimes that if computers, technology, artificial intelligence would replace teachers, and I don't think that will never happen, at least not in the next 10 years. I believe that it's very important, the work that teachers do, and it has to be cherished, and we have to make that profession, that vocations, be something that is well seen in our society, and give more capacity training to them. And
that's really important note to make is, and we've found in our research as well, when we did our large study called Education in 2030, we had 5 scenarios there, and the most popular scenario by far was called peer-to-peer, which was essentially people wanting to learn from their peers and from other people. And in all of our research, we've found nearly every learner has a preference to learn hard things from another person. We all want, I want my phone to teach me things for sure. Like I wish it was smarter and could prompt me with knowledge and help me, remember things and prompt me with interesting facts. But when it comes down to learning something really difficult, absolutely, I would just love to have an expert to, guide me and ask questions and get unstuck from problems. And that's what we find around the world.
Yes. So I brought up the subject of AI in education. I myself, in one of my previous lives, did a PhD in artificial intelligence. And I've seen that during the last decades, the promise of AI and the failure to deliver. We are talking a lot about AI in higher ed and in education in general, but do you think that the promise of AI is for real this time?
I don't know. I think we suffer a lot from over-promising, for sure, and optimism about artificial intelligence. I mean, not as detailed as you, Pepe, but I've spent a whole bunch of time on natural language processing, and computers are great at literal translation, but Siri is still hopeless. Like I can't talk to my devices. They don't understand me. How are you going to have an intelligent interface that, gets anywhere near a human level? So I'm really optimistic about the use of AI in very narrow domains. Like I've seen some fantastic use in testing and in assessment and in gamification and in trying to engage the learner in behavioral domains. And there's some fabulous uses of AI, but the best are often not even labeled AI. They're teams who are just focused on achieving the behavioral outcome or the learning outcome, versus the teams who are waving big AI banners and promising things that are very, very difficult to achieve. So I'm optimistic about if we can get AI to a level of maturity. I'm really excited about how we could embed it into the learning process, but a little bit pessimistic maybe, having followed artificial intelligence for decades as well, about how realistic it is that we would get to that level in the next 5 years for sure, probably 10. I mean, have a look at COVID. We don't need AI to solve the challenges that we've got right now. We need our universities to be more digitally capable, to have basic systems, to support learners with basic learning. That if we did that, we'd be 10 times what we are today, right? And so COVID makes me think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs as like all the way back down to the bottom of like, we just need to do the essentials and we need to do them digitally. And once we're through that, then we can start to build up the pyramid again and get to fancy applications like artificial intelligence.
Exactly. Yes, I believe that there are, as a sector, economic sector, education is very, very little digitized. No, it's not very strongly digitized, and AI comes later, maybe in the path, and we could be, let's say, cautiously optimistic. No, not a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I believe that AI should be more like an assistant to the professor than a standalone thing in education. It should be something that help the teacher, the professor, to do better his work, giving him more opportunities to understand his students and understand what's the level of engagement and learning they are, so that you can somehow personalize activities, not with AI but in person, no? So that you can teach them, you can do peer learning, etc., with the help of those tools, and not as a standalone tools, no? So that's something that could be more realistic because of the narrow applications of AI in general.
Yeah, and I something I think about a lot is, I mean, firstly, AI as a label has just taken over. Like a lot of what we can need to achieve, we can do with just calculations and computations. We don't actually need, when you really dig into AI, a domain expert like yourself, we don't necessarily need that much superpower right now. But the other thing is like the evolution of learning science. Like AI requires metrics, it requires calculations, and learning has been quite unquantified for a long period of time. And whether it's behavioral psychology or all of these studies, I think one of the good things it's doing is pushing us all to codify and quantify learning science more and try and advance that discipline at a level where we can explain pedagogy in a more quantifiable and scientific way than perhaps we might have 10 or 20 or 100 years ago. The magic of putting people in a class with someone who's just incredible at sharing knowledge and engaging learners.
Yes, that's very, very interesting. And when you were talking about that, I remember, I don't know if it's an article or a quote from George Siemens that say that the empowerment that will give us a world that combines human and artificial cognition, no? So that's, I think there are very interesting opportunities in that world.
Definitely.
Thank you, Patrick, for your time and for sharing with us your thoughts on the future of education, and also for sharing HolonIQ work and knowledge on higher ed. This talk has been very interesting and enjoyable, and it will surely be of great value to our audience. We look forward to discuss education and technology matters with you again. I expect that will be very soon. Thank you very much again, and have a great day, Patrick.
Thank you, Pepe. Wonderful to be here.
For more information, visit observatory.tech.mx/EduTrends podcast and ife.tech.mx. A special thanks to Tecnológico de Monterrey, the Institute for the Future of Education, and the Tec Sounds team. Tec Sounds producer Miguel Mejia, EduTrends producers Esteban Venegas and Cristian Guijosa, post-production Alejandro Sanchez. Stay tuned and play Tec Sounds in your favorite podcast app for other great shows and content.